There is a difference between knowing an empire will collapse and understanding what the collapse actually feels like. People imagine decline as a gentle slope downward, a slow fading of relevance, something that takes a generation to notice. They picture dusty libraries, aging leaders who do not matter anymore, and long debates in Parliament about how to reform the budget. But that is not how it happens. When empires collapse, the transition is violent and sudden, and for those living inside the system, it feels like the lights going out. There is no warning bell, no public service announcement. Collapse is invisible until the moment it becomes undeniable. In 410 AD, Rome still saw itself as the eternal city, unconquered for 8 centuries. It was the heart of an empire that had dominated the known world, the symbol of civilization, the place people believed could never fall, because so much history and divine destiny was attached to it. Then the Visigoths entered. For 3 days, the most sacred temples were looted. Patricians, those who traced their lineage back generations, were dragged from their villas and held for ransom. Citizens fled with what little they could carry. What outsiders saw as the end of an age, Romans experienced as pure disbelief. It was not a metaphor. It was homes burning, screams in the streets, smoke rising above the forum. The empire that had shaped the ancient world died in real time, and the people living there only understood what had happened after it was already irreversibly over. In June 1940, France was still celebrating its military heritage. Politicians claimed they possessed the strongest army in Europe. The Maginot Line was believed impregnable. Weeks later, German armored columns were rolling through Paris with hardly any resistance. The government fled south. The nation surrendered. 4 weeks. That was all it took for a world power to become a subordinate state. Books would later analyze strategies, leadership failures, or military innovation. But for ordinary French citizens, the experience was more primal: confusion, abandonment, and the terrifying knowledge that the people who promised to defend them had simply left. In December 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev still occupied the presidency of the Soviet Union, a superpower with tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. Diplomatic missions still called it one of 2 poles in a bipolar world. By December 26th, the Soviet Union vanished as a legal and political entity. A nation that had reshaped the 20th century dissolved in less than 1,000 days from the fall of the Berlin Wall to its final legal breath. The collapse was so fast that analysts, historians, even intelligence agencies could not keep up. Citizens woke up one morning under one flag and went to bed under another. No battlefield, no invasion, no dramatic siege. Just the quiet splintering of confidence. 3 empires, 3 collapses, each happening faster than the last. And here is the terrifying lesson. Collapse does not arrive when you expect it. It does not wait for a calendar date or allow society to prepare itself. It arrives like a sudden illness. One day, you are perfectly healthy. The next, you are being rushed to the hospital. By the time people realize they are living through the end is already history. The reason collapse happens so fast is simple: leverage and confidence. Empires do not run on material resources. They run on belief. Confidence that the currency has value. Confidence that the army will protect the nation. Confidence that the government can maintain order and continuity. Confidence that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Confidence is invisible, intangible, and fragile. It does not erode gradually. It snaps. Picture a massive dam. For years, small cracks form. Water seeps through. Engineers patch the leaks, claim the situation is under control. Life continues below as if nothing is wrong. The dam has always held. Therefore, it will always hold. Then a single crack widens, pressure spikes, and the entire structure disintegrates. Not slowly, but in a moment. The torrent is not gentle. It is a wall of catastrophe. People downstream do not have hours. They have minutes. The engineers writing optimistic reports vanish from relevance. Only the flood remains. Imperial collapse works the same way. The empire is the dam. The pressure is military overextension, rising debt, political division, erosion of institutions, loss of credibility, demographic decay. Those pressures accumulate silently for years until a trigger, often trivial compared to the scale of the empire, breaks confidence. And when confidence breaks, every institution reliant on it collapses at once. Currency, military loyalty, bureaucratic normalcy, elite networks, even social trust. Collapse is not a sequence of failures. It is simultaneous system failure. To understand what it looks like, you cannot study the decades of decline. You must examine the moment of rupture itself, when people who believed they were living in a stable world suddenly confront a reality where the old rules no longer apply. Consider Rome. For centuries, citizens believed the Roman legions were the greatest military force on earth. Even when the empire weakened, that belief remained. Barbarian raids at the border were seen as annoyances. The currency was debased, but markets still functioned. Politicians bickered, but the Senate still existed. Collapse was theoretical. Then came Alaric. His first siege was not a conquest, but a negotiation. He demanded gold, silver, grain. Rome paid, and people congratulated themselves on having preserved peace. They did not realize they had revealed the fatal vulnerability. The empire could no longer win. It could only purchase time. When Alaric returned, Rome paid again, though the treasury was already exhausted. The third time, Rome could not pay. The gates opened from within, not from heroic resistance or glorious warfare, from slaves and residents desperate to survive. The Visigoths poured in. The city that believed itself eternal discovered that eternity is not a divine promise, but a human illusion. After 3 days of looting, Alaric departed. Rome still existed physically, but psychologically. It was dead. The spell was broken. The idea of invincibility evaporated. And once the idea was gone, the empire unraveled. Within 2 generations, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. Think about being a citizen then. Your savings, once the pride of your family, were worthless because the coinage was diluted to near nothing. Your property, your villa, your farm, your inheritance meant nothing because marauders could claim it with a sword. Your social rank collapsed. Aristocrats were ransomed or slaughtered. You stood at a crossroads with no map. Stay and perhaps die. Flee and become a refugee, or collaborate with invaders, and risk later shame or execution. Collapse is not an intellectual concept. It is waking up one morning and realizing every institution that guaranteed your life has vanished. France in 1940 was another lesson in the brutality of speed. Leaders believed their fortifications made them invulnerable. Strategists assumed tanks could never cross the Ardennes. When the impossible happened, the entire system crumbled. The speed of collapse was not because France lacked soldiers or weapons, but because its leadership was psychologically anchored in a previous war. They defended yesterday while Germany fought tomorrow. The human cost was immense. Millions displaced, convoys of refugees clogging highways with cattle, furniture, and children. Radios spoke of patriotic duty, but citizens knew the truth. The government had abandoned them. When a state loses legitimacy, it loses its people. The Soviet Union's end was quieter, but no less dramatic. Its economy had decayed for decades. Its military was overextended. Internal corruption hollowed its core. But internationally it appeared powerful until the moment it stopped being so. When republics seceded, the empire did not mobilize armies to reclaim them. It simply dissolved. Citizens exchanged rubles for nothing. Veterans who once commanded respect queued for bread. Professors became taxi drivers, not because they lacked talent, but because the institutions that validated their roles evaporated. Collapse is the instant when reputation dies and reality asserts itself. It is the moment people discover that the system they trusted was held together not by steel or wealth or law, but by shared belief. And belief, once shattered, cannot be patched back together. History does not offer reassurance. It offers a warning. Collapse arrives faster than anyone wants to admit, and the people living through it always think they will have more time. Your savings became worthless. The French economy, once the backbone of European industry, was suddenly subject to the dictates of a foreign occupier. Money in your bank account was something the Germans could freeze, seize, or render irrelevant by decree. Property that had belonged to your family for generations. Your shop, your farmland, your apartment in Paris could be taken in the name of military necessity. Your freedom, the thing citizens assume is permanent, vanished without a fight. France did not lose influence gradually. It went from superpower to occupied territory in 6 weeks, and the people who lived through it were paralyzed by disbelief. They had been raised to think their nation was invulnerable. School textbooks, speeches, and popular culture told them they were the heirs of Napoleon and the victors of the Great War. To them, the army was invincible, right up until the morning it collapsed. The psychological wound was deeper than any economic cost. When an empire breaks, it is not just governments that fail. It is the collapse of a worldview. A lifetime of assumptions about your country, your identity, your safety evaporates. You wake up and realize there are soldiers on the streets, curfews you did not agree to, and laws written in a language you do not speak. It happens so quickly that the mind cannot adapt. A person who grew up thinking they lived in the center of civilization is forced to become obedient to an occupier, grateful even, if they are allowed to keep their home or rations. That is the cruelty of collapse. Its speed destroys not just society, but the stories people tell themselves about who they are. The Soviet Union in 1991 followed the same pattern. By the late 1980s, the entire world could see that the Soviet system was rotting internally. Factories could not produce basic goods. Lines for bread snaked around every city block, and Eastern Europeans openly resisted Moscow's control. But despite the cracks, the USSR still looked like a superpower from the outside. It had nuclear arsenals, spies across the globe, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and a propaganda machine that had convinced its population for nearly half a century that they were destined to outlast the decadent West. Collapse was something that academics debated in secret, not something anyone thought would arrive in their lifetime. Then the Berlin Wall fell. East Germany disintegrated almost overnight, a state built on surveillance and fear crumbling under its own weight. The Soviet government did not intervene, not because it was merciful, but because it was bankrupt. Tanks and soldiers cost money. Maintaining empire costs money. When the resources run out, even ideology becomes powerless. Within a year, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, all the satellite states rejected Soviet domination. For 70 years, these nations had been chained to Moscow. Suddenly they walked away. But even after the empire disintegrated around it, people believed the Soviet Union itself would endure. The core Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Central Asia was too large, too nuclear, too historical to vanish. The system had to hold. They had been taught that the USSR was not just a government, but a destiny, an iron force of history that could not be undone. It did not hold. In August 1991, a group of hardline communists attempted a coup. They believed they were saving the nation. They shattered it. The military, the very instrument of Soviet power, refused to fire on civilians. In a nation built on fear and obedience, the soldiers decided they would no longer obey. The Red Army, which had once marched into Berlin, would not march into Moscow to crush protesters. In that moment, the empire died. Not through invasion, but through disbelief. The institutions that maintained it no longer believed in themselves. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, climbed onto a tank and became the de facto leader of the Federation. Mikhail Gorbachev, still technically president of the Soviet Union, became irrelevant to his own state. Over the next few months, the republics declared independence one after another. Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, the Baltic states. They did not ask permission. They simply left because they knew the center could no longer force them to stay. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned. The next day, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. A superpower with 30,000 nuclear warheads dissolved in under 1,000 days. It was not a military defeat. No invasion, no siege, no defending army. It was collapse from within economic exhaustion, political paralysis, and the loss of collective confidence. The empire died the way a body dies when its heart stops, instantly. What did Soviet citizens experience? Imagine waking up and discovering your country. The country stamped on your passport, the anthem you heard at school assemblies. The government that you assumed would exist forever was gone. Your savings evaporated in weeks. Hyperinflation stripped the ruble of meaning. Currency became paper that could not buy food. Pensions, earned over a lifetime, became worthless. The state-run housing system collapsed. Apartments could be seized or sold illegally. Factories closed, throwing millions into unemployment. Crime exploded because the police were not being paid. Soldiers sold rifles, ammunition, even missiles on the black market, simply to feed their families. Entire regions fell into warlord rule. In places like Transnistria, Chechnya, and Tajikistan, the line between militia and government vanished. If you were a Soviet citizen in 1991, your world ended. Not metaphorically, literally. And it happened in less than 3 years. 3 collapses. Rome, France, and the Soviet Union. Each believed they were immune. Each was wrong. And each followed the same pattern, like a sequence written into the nature of power itself. There are 6 phases. The death cycle of empires. And once you recognize the sequence, you see it everywhere. Repeating faster each time society becomes more connected, more leveraged, more complacent. First comes denial. The empire is obviously deteriorating. Debt is piling. Currency is diluted. Military commitments exceed resources. Cities decay. Institutions rot. But officials insist it is temporary. Politicians say this is a rough period, not a structural failure. They cite past crises to justify optimism. We survived worse. We will recover. Citizens cling to this reassurance because the alternative that their nation is collapsing is too frightening to contemplate. Rome lived in denial for 60 years. France pretended strength for 2 decades before the Wehrmacht shattered it. The Soviet Union spent 19 years insisting communism was inevitable. Denial persists until reality forces itself into view. Then comes the credibility break, the moment when reputation dies. A single event exposes the empire's weakness so dramatically that no propaganda can repair it. For Rome, the destruction of its legions at Adrianople. For France, the fall of Paris. For the Soviets, Afghanistan, 10 years of fighting peasants armed with rifles and homemade bombs. When credibility breaks, allies lose faith, enemies grow bold, and citizens understand what leaders always feared. The empire's power was an illusion. After the credibility break comes the cascade. Everything fails at once. Alliances crumble. Currencies plunge. Markets panic. Borders become porous. Crime rises. Trust evaporates. The collapse accelerates exponentially because every system depends on every other system. The empire no longer controls events. It reacts to them. Rome cascaded for 66 years. France for 6 weeks. The Soviets for 900 days. Each collapse faster than the last. Because information, capital, and fear now move at the speed of communication. And then comes fragmentation, the splitting of the whole into desperate parts. Provinces break away. Colonies rebel. Regional leaders refuse orders. Local interests become more rational than loyalty to the center. The empire cannot pay its armies, cannot fund its bureaucracy, cannot maintain its infrastructure. The periphery chooses independence not out of courage, but because the core has nothing left to offer. Once fragmentation begins, there is no return. Every empire in history has hit this stage and then disappeared. Phase 5 is the freefall, the moment when the empire no longer merely declines, but ceases to function as a state. Currency collapses completely. It does not matter whether it is hyperinflation or deflation. Both destroy confidence. Money becomes meaningless. You cannot plan, you cannot save, you cannot trade. The economy locks up. Supply chains seize because nobody trusts tomorrow's price. Food becomes scarce, not because there are no fields or no farmers, but because distribution networks cannot operate without predictable exchange. Energy becomes unreliable, electricity sporadic, fuel rationed. Government authority evaporates, not by decree, but because it cannot enforce anything. Ordinary people stop obeying laws, because laws are only paper without an institution capable of punishment. Crime surges. Not the polite, invisible crime of white-collar finance, but the physical kind: robbery, extortion, kidnapping, murder. Regions fall under the control of militias, warlords, or whoever has guns and food. The state becomes a ghost, incapable of asserting even basic order. Rome entered freefall between the mid-5th century and its final collapse. Starvation spread as trade networks died. The rich hoarded grain behind fortified walls. Urban centers emptied. Barbarian tribes raided with impunity, not because they were stronger than Rome ever had been, but because Rome could no longer coordinate its defenses. Soldiers deserted or sold their loyalty to local strongmen. The central government, once omnipotent, became a powerless symbol. Bishops, landlords, and warlords filled the vacuum. You did not ask the emperor for safety. You asked the man with the legion in your town. France experienced its free fall under occupation. From 900 to liberation, the French state was a shadow. Vichy collaborated because it had no ability to resist. The French people were divided between resistance fighters, collaborators, opportunists, and terrified civilians who simply wanted food. Institutions that once embodied national pride were corrupted or neutralized. Schools taught German propaganda. Police arrested their own citizens. The law existed, but it was no longer French law, and so society splintered into parallel realities. Those in uniform who enforced foreign authority, those underground who sabotaged it, and those caught helpless in between. The Soviet Union's freefall lasted through the 1990s. Hyperinflation destroyed savings and pensions. Economists often reduce this to numbers, but to live through it is different. Prices doubled between paychecks, wages arrived late or not at all, and old people sold their furniture just to buy bread. Traffic police extorted drivers for cash because the state could not pay them. Crime syndicates, not governments, provided security. They controlled ports, metals, timber pits and oil. They decided who could open a business, who could survive in certain neighborhoods. Former soldiers flooded the black market with weapons. Cities turned into fiefdoms. Moscow pretended to govern a nation, but each region governed itself according to need, fear, or profit. The empire had fallen, and what followed was not order. It was chaos disguised as reform. The free fall phase is where ordinary people suffer most. The collapse of currency, law, and logistics does not simply inconvenience the population. It shoves them into a primitive struggle for survival. Every system they relied on fails simultaneously. Food distribution is no longer a national network. It becomes dozens or hundreds of improvised systems, family gardens, local barter, mafia-controlled supply chains. Medicine becomes inaccessible, not because doctors stop existing, but because hospitals cannot pay them or stock antibiotics. Education turns irrelevant because survival replaces ambition. In freefall, the state no longer matters except as an obstacle or a looter. Citizens stop thinking like participants in a society and start thinking like individuals, trying to outlast winter. Eventually, after every empire crashes through denial, credibility loss, cascade, fragmentation, and freefall, there is Phase 6, the reset. It is not recovery. It is not restoration. It is a replacement. The old system, political, economic, spiritual, dies, and something fundamentally new takes its place. Sometimes the reset is imposed from outside. Sometimes it emerges from civil war, and sometimes from exhaustion. But it always comes. Rome's reset became medieval Europe, the kingdoms of the Franks, Visigoths, Lombards, and Anglo-Saxons. The imperial bureaucracy dissolved, the legions vanished, the tax system disintegrated. What replaced them was feudalism, a decentralized order built on land, obligation, and force. The average Roman citizen never saw Rome return. They became subjects of lords. Their identity shifted from imperial to local in a single generation. France's reset came from liberation, but not to its old role. Before 1940, France imagined itself a global hegemon. After 1945, it became a secondary power in an American world. It kept its culture, its history, its pride. But the foundation of its geopolitics was gone. It surrendered colonies, accepted NATO, and participated in a world it no longer controlled. The empire was dead. What remained was a modern republic navigating constraints it could no longer dictate. The Soviet Union's reset shattered into Russia and 14 independent republics. The USSR did not shrink, it ceased to exist. Russians woke up in one country and went to bed in 15. The red flag lowered. The anthem changed. The institutions dissolved. The reset was not a return to communism or a revised version of socialism. It was a new survival strategy. Raw capitalism, oligarchy, privatization, and geopolitical redefinition. For millions, it was disorienting. They had spent their entire lives believing their nation was eternal, and overnight it became a historical footnote. Every empire that collapses goes through the same 6 phases: denial, credibility break, cascade, fragmentation, freefall, and reset. The pattern is not metaphoric. It is structural. Complex systems die the way stars do, not gradually, but all at once after a critical threshold is breached. And the United States is entering the second phase now. Denial ended quietly, not with speeches, but with exhaustion. 2 decades of telling the public everything would be fine, despite war, financial crises, inflation, debt, pandemics, and political rot, finally failed. People can see the cracks. Phase 2, the credibility break, has already begun. The Afghanistan withdrawal stripped the illusion of military invincibility. 20 years of occupation, trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, and a medieval militia took power in 11 days. Allies were abandoned at the airport. Civilians clung to aircraft and fell from the sky. The entire world watched the greatest military in history flee in chaos. China watched. Russia watched. Iran watched. They did not analyze the tactical mistakes. They saw weakness. A credibility break is when reputation dies publicly. And Afghanistan is only one fracture. The dollar is losing its monopoly. In 2000, Nearly 3/4 of global reserves were held in dollars. Now it is barely over half and declining as countries search for alternatives. BRIC settlements, yuan for oil, bilateral trade outside SWIFT. When nations no longer believe your currency will hold value, they stop storing their future in it. The Wu. Chaos. Military faces recruitment shortages, aging fleets, and declining readiness. Even Congress and the Supreme Court, once respected pillars of governance, are viewed with contempt. Trust in institutions has collapsed. These are not random failures. They are symptoms of a credibility break. We are at the beginning of Phase 2. And if history holds, Phase 3 cascade will arrive quickly, triggered by an event that exposes fragility. It may be military defeat in the Pacific, a debt crisis that spirals into insolvency, or a contested political election that fractures the Union. The mechanism does not matter. The pattern does. Because once confidence breaks, collapse accelerates with a speed no institution can stop. If history is a guide, the United States will not descend slowly. It will fall faster than the Soviet Union, because information moves instantly, because capital evaporates at electronic speed, because loyalty dissolves in real time. Once the cascade begins, 18 to 36 months may be enough to reach fragmentation. And after that comes freefall. After that, the reset. When the collapse begins, you won't feel it as an abstract debate or a historical analogy. You will feel it in your daily life. The tipping point comes through the currency. Stability dissolves. Inflation that was dismissed as transitory becomes a runaway fire. 5% becomes 20, then 50, then triple digits. Your savings shrink in real time. You watch the numbers in your bank account, but the purchasing power behind them evaporates. You wake up one morning and everything is more expensive. A tank of gas at 4 that now costs 20. Groceries that were 100 cost 500. Salaries, even if you still have a job, lag months behind reality. The silent certainty you had that the dollars you earned would be meaningful. Tomorrow is gone. Imports vanish into luxury territory. Electronics, pharmaceuticals, foreign goods, items you once took for granted, become as rare as gold. Because the global supply chains you depended on no longer function. It is not that products disappear. The system that moves them collapses under the pressure of broken finance and broken trust. As the money dies, social order decays. Governments default on promises they never thought they would have to keep. Police departments can't pay salaries. Cities can't maintain basic services. Crime surges. Theft becomes normal. Violent robbery becomes frequent. Home invasions stop being sensational news. They are weekly occurrences. If you are wealthy, you hire private security. If you are not, you barricade your doors and hope your kids come home safe. Protest becomes a constant. Riots stop being a shocking outburst and become an ecosystem. The institutions you believed in, courts, legislatures, media, lose authority. Laws become suggestion. People stop cooperating because they no longer think the system is real. And when belief dies, the social contract dies with it. Then comes fragmentation. The federal government becomes a silhouette of power without substance. States go rogue. Some pursue independence. Others form regional blocs. Others simply ignore Washington because there is no consequence for disobedience. California negotiates trade agreements with China. Texas hints at sovereignty. Military bases shut down quietly because the empire can no longer finance its reach abroad. Troops come home not because of strategy, but because the treasury is empty. Allies that once depended on American guarantees begin managing their own survival. Global networks that once orbit the dollar now drift away. The empire retracts to its own soil, and even the homeland fractures under competing interests. Next comes systemic economic failure. Unemployment spikes catastrophically. Businesses evaporate. Banks collapse. The retirement accounts that defined your future, the 401k, the pension go up in smoke. Real estate collapses because nobody can afford debt. The stock market, for decades a symbol of prosperity, becomes a graveyard of paper fortunes. Wealth stored in dollars dissolves into ash. Only those who held assets with intrinsic value land. Commodities, jazz, foreign currency, precious metals survive intact. But most citizens who trusted the system, who saved in dollars, are wiped out in an instant. They become part of a class that history recognizes. Educated, talented, hard-working people reduced to irrelevance by a failed currency. After that, the survival phase begins. The questions change. You stop thinking about elections, foreign policy, and ideology. You think about food. You think about clean water. You think about how to keep your family safe at night. You think about who you trust when the grid goes down. You think about community, not theory, because the institutions that guaranteed normal life, supermarkets, pensions, banks, insurance, police no longer function. The illusion of stability dissolves, and you realize the state has already failed. Collapse is not a polite recession, not a linear decline. It is a violent, accelerating disorienting the transformation of society. It happens faster than your instincts can adapt to it. The question then becomes, can this be avoided? In theory, yes. In practice, no empire has ever chosen the path that prevents its collapse. To prevent the cascade, the United States would have to do what no dominant power has done. It would have to confess that it is declining publicly, honestly, decisively. That admission would trigger immediate geopolitical backlash. Allies would panic. Enemies would probe. Markets would implode. Power does not survive through humility. It only survives through supremacy. To avoid collapse, the United States would need to dismantle the imperial architecture deliberately, /military spending, close hundreds of bases, withdraw from the role of global police. But a superpower does not willingly step off the stage because retreat looks like defeat, and defeat accelerates collapse. It would have to control its debt. That means either brutal spending cuts or massive tax increases. The first option destroys the economy. The second triggers capital flight and political revolt. There is no painless solution, no technocratic fix. Restoring manufacturing would require rebuilding entire industrial ecosystems gutted for decades. That takes 20 to 30 years, time the empire does not have. Rebuilding trust would require reversing polarization, reforming institutions, healing a fractured society. No government in history has done that voluntarily. And even when crisis forces action, it arrives too late. The tectonic plates have already shifted. Institutions adjust only after rupture. The tragedy is not ideological. It is mathematical. Empires that overspend die. Empires that debase their currency die. Empires that overextend militarily die. These are not opinions. They are patterns repeated across civilizations. Rome, France, the Soviet Union. The script is constant. The United States has committed all wars at a larger scale than any predecessor. The pattern has already locked in. The argument is no longer about whether collapse is possible. It is about when. And when it comes, it will be faster than any empire before, because modern systems collapse in real time. Digital markets do not collapse in decades. They collapse in hours. Confidence does not fade. It vanishes. You are living at the end of the American empire. Most people can't feel it, because collapse feels like normal until the moment it does not. People in Rome in 409 had thought they had decades. Parisians in May 1940 thought the army would hold. Soviets in 1988 thought the Union was eternal. They believed everything was fine until the day the world they knew ceased to exist. History is not subtle. It leaves warnings carved into the ruins of every fallen empire. Those who study it see the pattern. Those who ignore it live inside it. The cascade has begun, and the only remaining question is whether you recognize it before it consumes you.